The grass along Bitter Willow Creek had gone the color of old straw by the middle of August, and it had not recovered. The creek itself still ran, but thin, a whisper of what it had been in spring. And the couple knew, the way people who work close to the land always know, that the numbers would not favor them come October. She stood at the root cellar door one September evening and counted what they had by lamplight. Turnips, some dried beans, a half bushel of cornmeal, 2 crocks of salted pork. She did not count it twice. Once was enough to understand that the winter ahead would ask more of them than last winter had, and last winter had already asked a great deal. He knew the tally, too. He did not need to see her face when she came back inside to understand what the cellar held. They had talked about it in the careful, quiet way that two people talk, when the subject underneath every sentence is fear, and they had agreed on small things: stretch the cornmeal, trade labor with their neighbor to the north for a share of his hay, see if the creek bottom would yield any late-season grazing. They had not agreed on what to do about the $11. He had been carrying that question for 2 weeks when the drover came through. The man arrived on a Thursday, moving south along the wagon road with a small and sorry-looking band of sheep that raised dust where they walked. 47 animals. He stopped at the general store in the settlement 4 miles east of their claim, and word traveled the way word travels on the high plains, quickly and with embellishment. Nearly hairless, people said, covered in patches, looked like something the coyotes had already considered and passed on. He rode into the settlement and saw them in the drover's temporary pen behind the livery. The description had not been wrong. The animals stood in the thin afternoon light with their strange, moth-eaten coats hanging off them in irregular tufts, ribs faintly visible beneath the skin, eyes dull with exhaustion. The drover was a frank man in the particular way that bankrupt men become frank. He wanted to move, he said, and he would take $11 for the lot of them if the buyer could take them today. The neighbors who had gathered to look were already drifting away. 2 men laughed, not unkindly at the very idea. He stood at the fence rail for a long time. He looked at the sheep, and he thought about the root cellar. He thought about the lean-to barn, empty now that their single mule had died in July. He thought about the $11 folded in the tin box beneath the floorboard, which was the last significant thing standing between them and a winter with no margin at all. Then he counted out the coins and bills into the drover's hand. He drove the sheep home in the late afternoon light, and he had not yet decided how he was going to explain it. He drove them up the creek road as the sun fell behind the ridge, and she was standing at the cabin door when she heard the sound. That particular soft complaint of sheep moving in a tired bunch, the shuffle of hooves in dry grass. She came to the fence and looked. She did not say anything right away. That was how she managed hard news. He had learned. She received it first in silence, and the words came after. The merchant had ridden out to look, as merchants sometimes did when something strange passed through. He stood at the gate with his thumbs in his belt and called it the sorriest flock in Wyoming territory, which was the sort of declaration a man makes when he wants to be remembered for having said it. A neighbor from the claim to the south came by and stood for a while without speaking, which was almost worse than speaking. Their expressions were not cruel exactly, just the particular satisfied resignation of people who have already decided how a thing will end. She thanked them both for coming and held the gate until they left. When they were gone, she walked into the lean-to alone and crouched among the animals in the near dark, and she began to look at them the way she had watched her father look at failing wheat, not at the surface of the thing, but beneath it, for what the surface was sitting on top of. The fleece was a ruin. There was no charitable way to say it. It hung in dry, uneven patches, some sections worn nearly to bare skin, others clumped in matted tufts that had lost all their crimp and spring. The animals were thin, visibly so, ribs present and accounted for, but she ran her hand along a ew's side and pressed gently, and the ewe turned and looked at her with an expression of mild interest rather than alarm. She looked at the skin beneath the patchy wool. It was pink. Not the ashen gray of a sick animal, not the mottled, scabbed skin of a disease that had gone in deep. Pink, the ordinary, living pink of a creature that had been badly treated on the outside, but had not yet given up on the inside. She checked another. Same. And another. She parted the tufts carefully with her fingers and held what little evening light remained against the skin, moving from animal to animal in the quiet of the lean-to, while the sheep shifted and settled around her. Their eyes, she noticed then, were clear. Tired, certainly. Road-worn, certainly. But there was light in them, that particular mild, considering light that livestock carry when they are still present in themselves, when the body has not yet begun the slow retreat. She sat back on her heels and listened to them breathe. He found her there a few minutes later, still crouched, still looking, and she said only, "Come see what I see." He came in low under the lean-to door and crouched beside her, and she guided his hand to the nearest ew's flank the same way she had guided her own, slowly, parting the sparse wool, pressing until the skin beneath caught the last angle of the lantern light. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he let out a breath that was not quite a sigh, and not quite a laugh, but something between the two, the sound a man makes when he has been bracing against bad news, and finds, instead, that the ground is still solid under him. That night they talked, until the candle was low, about what the sheep needed most before winter closed in. They agreed on two things without much debate: feed and warmth. The feed she would work out. The warmth was his problem to solve, and he lay awake in the dark, turning it over, the way he turned every problem, quietly, methodically, the way his father had taught him to work a stubborn field before you ever drove the first furrow. By morning he had his answer. He would build a pen inside the lean-to, not simply a fence of rails, but a true insulated room, walls of stacked straw bales, and a low ceiling of woven willow branches, laid thick and close, small enough that the body heat of the animals themselves would hold the air. He had seen something like it once in Nebraska, built for a sow and her litter, through a hard February. It had worked then, it would work now. He started that same afternoon and worked by lantern light after the sun dropped, which came earlier, every day now. His hands blistered on the haywire by the third evening, and the blisters opened, and he wrapped them in strips of flour sacking, and kept on. She brought him coffee he forgot to drink, and found the cup cold beside the lantern each morning. On the fourth night she stood in the lean-to doorway and told him plainly that she was frightened, not of the cold and not of the work, but of what would happen to them if the sheep did not come back. If $11 of borrowed hope simply lay down in the straw one morning and did not rise, she said she needed to know he believed it was possible, and not just that he was building, because building was the only thing he knew to do when he was afraid. He set down the wire stretcher and looked at her across the half-finished pen, and they had their first real argument since the purchase, sharp and honest and not quite fair on either side, the way arguments are between people who trust each other enough to mean what they say. It lasted perhaps 10 minutes. What ended it was not cleverness. It was that she crossed the pen and picked up the other end of the wire he had set down and held it steady for him without a word, and he understood that they had already answered the question together, whether they knew it yet or not. The satchel had come with the tack, a cracked leather bag with a broken buckle, stuffed under the seat of the drover's wagon, and thrown in without ceremony when the deal was made. It held a rusted hoof pick, a coil of baling twine, a folded piece of oilskin, and at the very bottom, pressed flat against the lining, as though it had been there a long time, a piece of paper folded into quarters. She found it 3 days after the argument, on a gray afternoon when the wind had gentled enough that she could hear herself think. She was sorting through the satchel for anything useful. They wasted nothing, could afford to waste nothing. and her fingers found the paper before her eyes did. It was water-stained along one edge, the ink in places feathered and faint, the folds worn soft as cloth from being opened and refolded many times by someone else's hands. She carried it to the cabin window and spread it flat on the sill. The handwriting was small and cramped, slanting hard to the right, as though the writer had been hurrying or cold. She could see immediately that it was not English, not entirely. Some of the words she recognized, scattered among the others, like familiar faces in a crowd of strangers. Sheep. Winter. Keep. But most of it was something else, something with a rhythm she couldn't place, words that curved in ways English didn't curve. She stood there a long time. Then she saw Lana. She did not know the language, but something in her recognized the shape of the word, the way it sat, surrounded by careful notations, numbers perhaps, or quantities, and she felt certain, without being able to say why, that it meant wool. And then, appearing again and again through the lower half of the page, sometimes underlined, sometimes written twice in the same line, Frio, Frio, Frio. Cold, she was sure of it. Cold, repeated like a warning or a promise. She read the page 3 more times, turning it in the light, willing the rest of it to open up to her. It would not. But she did not set it aside. She folded it carefully along its old creases and tucked it into the small wooden box on the shelf where she kept her few important things: the land claim receipt, her mother's letter, a button from her wedding dress. When he came in from the barn that evening, she told him what she had found. She spread it on the table between them and pointed to the 2 words she recognized, her finger tracing the lines of cramped foreign script. He studied it in silence for a moment, his brow furrowed, turning it once as she had done. Neither of them could read it. Neither of them knew yet whose hands had written it, or what mountain it had come down from, or why it mentioned cold so many times. But they both felt, without quite saying so, that the paper knew something about those sheep that they did not yet know themselves. October came in on a gray shoulder, the wind off the Laramie Basin carrying real cold now, not the teasing bite of late September, but the kind that settled into the ground and did not leave. The creek at the edge of the claim went quiet along its margins, a thin skin of ice forming each night and lasting a little longer each morning. The sheep were still thin. The patchy fleece had not worsened, but it had not improved either, and when he spread fresh straw in the insulated inner pen he had finished building inside the lean-to, he counted every one of them by habit, 47, the way a man counts something he is afraid of losing. She had been thinking about the note. She could not decipher it, but she kept returning to what little she could, that word repeated like a refrain, cold. She told herself that whoever had written it knew these animals, had lived with them through something. Whatever they needed, the paper suggested, it had something to do with cold, which meant the coming months were either the best thing or the worst thing that could happen to them. She decided to believe it was the best. In the meantime, she worked on what she could control, the feed. She had been giving them cracked corn and dried meadow grass from the summer cutting, rationed out carefully in the mornings. It was enough to keep them upright, but not enough to bring them back. She sat with the problem the way she had learned to sit with hard things, quietly, and from several angles. He was the one who mentioned linseed. He said it almost offhandedly one evening, not looking up from the harness he was mending. There had been a farmhand on the Nebraska place where he'd worked at 19, an older man, methodical and quiet, who had pulled a sickly colt through a bad spring with a linseed ration mixed into the grain. Something about the oil of it, the man had said. Something that fed the skin from the inside. She listened. She thought about it overnight, and the next morning went to the root cellar and came back with the small sack of linseed she had been saving, without quite knowing why. She added it to the morning mixture, a small measure, careful not to overfeed what the animals could not yet handle. And she began boiling pine boughs in the evening and pouring the cooled broth over the feed, something she remembered her mother doing once for a wormy dog, which had seemed like superstition at the time and now seemed like wisdom. 3 weeks passed. The cold deepened. The pen held its warmth. And then one morning, she was working in the barn and she stopped. She set down the feed bucket and stood very still. Then she called to him quietly. He came and stood beside her in the doorway of the inner pen, and neither of them spoke. On the backs of 2 sheep, soft and pale as winter light, the first thin wisps of new fleece had begun to come in. November came in gently, as if apologizing for what had gone before. The wind softened. The sky held a pale, watery blue for days at a stretch, and the creek did not freeze past its edges. After weeks of bracing against the cold like a man leaning into a headwind, the sudden mildness felt almost suspicious, something to be received carefully, the way you might accept a gift from a stranger, grateful but watchful. But the sheep were eating. That was the fact that steadied everything else. They came to the feed trough without the hollow, reluctant shuffle of sick animals. Their eyes had cleared. And the wool was doing something. It had started on 2. Now it was spreading across a dozen, then more. Not thick yet, nothing that would draw a second glance from anyone who hadn't spent the last week studying those bare backs the way a man studies a sky before weather. But it was there, pale, fine, tightly crimped even at this early stage, each new wisp curling close to the skin as though the animal were holding it carefully, not wanting to waste it. She kept a folded piece of paper in her apron pocket where she made small marks, a tally of the animals showing new growth, updated each morning. She did not share this habit with him, not because she was hiding it, but because she wasn't yet sure what the marks meant. She was gathering evidence. She had always been that kind of person. One evening in the middle of the month, after the feeding was done and the barn secured and the lamp trimmed low, he unfolded the shepherd's note on the table between them. It had become a ritual of sorts, returning to it when the week allowed, trying again at the words they had not yet cracked. His Spanish was almost nothing. Hers was a handful of words her father had traded with a neighboring family for, years ago, and mostly forgotten. But they had made progress over the weeks. A word here, a phrase there. Context doing the work that vocabulary could not. That evening they pieced together something new. A line near the middle of the note, written in a hand that slanted sharply, as if pressed for time. Dos razas, 20 años. 2 breeds, 20 years. And then the English that followed, cramped and careful. Cold mountain blood, fine plains blood, bred to hold together what neither could hold alone. They sat with that for a while. He said, slowly, that it sounded like the man had been making something, deliberately, over a long time. She agreed. She looked at the note and then at the window, though there was nothing to see beyond it but darkness and their own reflection. So these were not ordinary sheep that had fallen on hard times. These were something that had been built. Neither of them said the word valuable. It seemed too early, too bold, too much like counting before the season was finished. But neither of them slept quickly that night. December came without ceremony. One morning, the water in the bucket by the cabin door had a skin of ice on it, and by noon, that ice had not melted, and they understood that the season had made its intention plain. That first hard freeze fell on a Tuesday. He spent the morning reinforcing the outer barn wall with a second layer of packed straw, tamping it into the gaps with the heel of his boot, while his breath came out in short white bursts. She banked the feed. Extra cracked corn, an additional handful of linseed stirred into the warm broth she ladled into the shallow trough, and watched the flock for signs of distress. The sheep pressed together near the inner pen's low entrance, heads low, patient in the way that animals sometimes are when they understand, without understanding. That stillness is survival. The first night, neither of them slept inside the cabin. They had agreed on shifts without much discussion, the way they agreed on most things: a glance, a nod, a division of labor that felt less like decision and more like instinct. He took the first hours, wrapped in both their heavy blankets with a lantern turned low, sitting on the milking stool just inside the barn door. She relieved him sometime past midnight. He was back before first light. Between them they had slept perhaps 4 hours each, broken and shallow, the cold a persistent presence even inside the straw bale walls. The second night was harder. The temperature dropped further, and a wind came in from the northwest that found every seam in the outer barn boards. She heard it working at the walls while she sat watch, heard the flock shifting and resettling, the soft percussion of their bodies against each other. She counted them by lantern light, all present, all breathing. The pen held its warmth in the way a cupped hand holds a coal, imperfectly, but enough. The third night, he sat with his back against the inner pen wall and felt, through the straw and the rough boards, the faint communal heat of 47 animals breathing in the dark. He said nothing to her about it until morning, when she came with a pot of coffee wrapped in cloth to hold its warmth, and he told her that what he'd felt was like leaning against something alive, the whole structure of it, breathing. By Christmas morning, all 47 were accounted for, standing, moving to the trough with the mild impatience of animals that trusted the routine. She was the one who noticed it first in full light. Crouching near the oldest ewe, the one they'd privately thought least likely to winter well, she reached out and pressed her palm against the animal's flank. The wool was dense under her hand, thick, dark at the base, curling tight against itself in a way that no sparse or struggling fleece ever curled. She did not call to him. She waited until he came to stand beside her, and then she let him find it for himself. It came the way real cold always comes on the high plains, not as a storm, not with wind or theater, but as a simple, total withdrawal of warmth, as though the sky had turned its back. She woke on the second day of January to a silence so complete it had its own weight. The water in the pitcher beside the washstand had frozen solid in the night, inside the cabin, 2 feet from the bank stove. He read the thermometer nailed to the barn post at first light, and did not say the number aloud. She saw it in the set of his jaw when he came back inside. -29, and the air had the flat, pressed quality of cold that intends to stay. They rearranged everything that first morning without discussion, moving by the efficient shorthand of a couple that had already spent a year learning each other's instincts. The woodpile they had considered adequate for February suddenly looked like what it was: not enough. He began rationing immediately, feeding the stove in measured intervals, keeping the cabin at survivable rather than comfortable. She packed every gap along the door threshold with strips cut from a worn wool blanket. They slept in their coats the first 3 nights, but the sheep demanded more than the cabin did. Twice each day, without exception, they crossed the yard together in the killing dark of early morning, and again at dusk. The wind, when it came, hit like something solid. She carried the feed pail inside her coat until the last possible moment to keep the linseed mixture from freezing into a useless mass. He carried hot water in a covered pot, swapping it from hand to hand to manage the heat, and poured it over the trough before it could skin with ice. The inner pen held. The straw bale walls kept the body heat of 47 animals circling back on itself, and when they ducked inside each time, the difference was something close to miraculous. Not warm, exactly, but alive, in a way the outer air was not. The sheep moved close together by habit now, the older ewes toward the center, and the sound of them breathing in the enclosed space was steady and rhythmic and deeply reassuring. The wood supply shrank faster than either of them acknowledged openly. On the 5th day, he walked the fence line to the northwest and found a dead cottonwood that had fallen across the creek bank, frozen solid, impossible to split cleanly, but burnable. He spent 3 hours with the axe and came back with enough to buy them 2 more days. She said nothing beyond thank you, and he understood she was saving words along with everything else. On the 8th night, she sat in the barn longer than necessary after the evening feeding, just listening to the flock settle. Outside, the cold pressed against the boards like something patient. They were holding. All 47 of them still holding. On the 9th day, the cold still had not broken, but something else did. She had sent word to the schoolteacher 3 weeks prior, a folded request tucked into the merchant's supply run, asking to borrow the woman's Spanish dictionary, the one she had seen sitting on the schoolroom shelf the previous autumn, when she had stopped in to return a borrowed pot. The book arrived on the 8th day, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with string, carried out by a freighter who asked no questions about why a sheepwoman on Bitter Willow Creek needed such a thing in January. She had been working at the note in spare minutes for weeks, but spare minutes had been scarce during the cold snap, and most of what she had managed were fragments, a word here, a phrase there, not enough to form a full picture. On the 9th morning, while he was out checking the fence line and hauling water, she sat at the table with the dictionary and the note spread flat before her, and she did not stop until the whole of it had been turned, line by careful line, into something she could read. It took most of the morning. When he came back inside, she was still sitting in the same place. She did not speak immediately. She waited until he had set down his coat and pulled his chair close to hers, until the candle between them steadied in the draught, and then held. Then she read it aloud. The shepherd, the old Basque man whose name was written once at the bottom of the page in careful letters, had spent 22 years breeding these animals, not carelessly, not by accident. He had chosen the merino for its fleece, fine and dense, and the Rambouillet for its cold tolerance, its deep chest, its will to endure, and he had crossed them and selected from those crosses with a patience that the note described plainly as the work of his life. The near baldness, he wrote, came from hard travel and poor feed and mange, conditions of the journey, not the animal. Beneath the damage, he had written, there is a fleece like no other. Given rest and proper feeding, these animals will grow a coat the cold cannot touch. She folded the note when she finished reading. He did not say anything for a long moment, neither did she. The candle burned between them. Outside, the cold pressed on. Inside, the silence was not empty. It was the kind that fills up slowly with something too large to name right away, something that needed to be felt before it could be spoken. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They had not known, and now they did, and the flock was still holding, all 47 of them, breathing steadily in the straw-warmed dark. On the morning of the 11th day, the wind simply stopped. There was no gradual easing, no slow softening of the cold. It released all at once, the way a held breath releases, and the silence that followed was so complete, it woke him before dawn. He lay still for a moment, listening to the absence of sound where the wind had been for so long. Then he rose. She was already pulling on her coat. They did not speak as they crossed the yard. The snow had crusted hard overnight, and it held their weight with a sound like cracking glass beneath each step. The sky in the east was the pale gray gold of first light, and the air, though still cold enough to sting, carried something different in it, a quality of stillness that felt almost like mercy. He lifted the barn latch. The door swung inward on a breath of warmth. The smell of the sheep met them first, lanolin and hay and something deeper, animal and alive, and then their eyes adjusted to the low light and they saw the flock, all 47, standing or lying in the straw, turning their heads toward the open door, their breath rising in small, quiet clouds. Alive, every one of them. But it was not just that they were alive. The fleece had changed. Even in that pale morning light, it was undeniable. Where the coats had been growing steadily through the winter, Now, having been tested by 11 days of cold so severe it should have killed animals twice their size, the wool had responded with something close to extravagance. It lay in deep, tightly crimped waves, extraordinarily dense at the skin, curling outward with a thickness that seemed almost unlikely. She reached out and pressed her hand against the nearest ew's side, and her fingers disappeared to the knuckle. He did the same. They looked at each other without speaking. They were still standing there, in the open barn door, when they heard the sound of a wagon on the road. Their neighbor, the one who had watched them bring the sheep home in September with that slow, deliberate silence that said everything, was passing along the track that ran beside the fence line. His wagon slowed, then stopped. He sat there on his bench with his hands wrapped around the reins, looking at the flock in the morning light. She could see his face from where she stood. He was not laughing. He was not doing anything she could easily name. He simply looked, for a long moment, at the animals no one had believed in. Then he gathered his reins, clicked his tongue at the horse, and drove on without a word. She turned back to the flock. He was already calculating something in his head. She could tell by the way he was looking at the nearest ewe, really looking, the way a man looks when a question is finally beginning to answer itself. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way things worth waiting for usually do, in pieces, in hints, in a day of warmth, followed by a night of cold that reminded them not to trust it yet. The snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first. The creek loosened. The willows along Bitter Willow Creek put out their first pale green buds, tentative as questions, and the sheep began spending longer hours outside, moving through the new grass with a deliberateness that looked almost like pleasure. She had been studying the note, the old shepherd's note, the one she had been reading and rereading all winter, and one phrase she had puzzled over for months finally opened itself to her. Tresquillar tarde. It said, near the bottom, sheer late, not when the calendar said, but when the animal said, when the fleece was ready to release, rather than still growing into itself. He asked a rancher passing through about hiring shearers. The man directed them instead to a fellow who had camped 2 miles east, a Basque-descended hand named Arriaga, who had learned the trade from his grandfather and traveled the territory picking up work as the season moved north. When Arriaga came and looked at the flock, he stopped walking. He stood very still, the way their neighbor had stood still at the fence line, but his expression was different. It was the look of a man recognizing something he had not expected to see in this particular place. He told them, in careful English with Spanish threaded through it, what they had. The cross line, the cold mountain breeding. He had seen animals like these once before, in the high country near Laramie, years ago, in the possession of an old man who had guarded them like a secret. He named the Basque shepherd whose note she had carried all winter, and she felt something move through her chest that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but something between the two. The shearing took the whole of a long April day. Arriaga worked with a calm precision that was almost ceremonial, and she and her husband followed his instruction closely, learning as they went. The fleece came away in dense, rolled blankets, heavier than she expected, creamy white and deep, the crimp in it so tight and fine it caught the morning light like rippled water. They filled their own sacks first, then the 2 they had borrowed from the neighbor who had lent them without asking why. Then they laid fleece on an old canvas sheet on the barn floor, because there was nowhere else to put it. By late afternoon they stood in the barn doorway, looking at what the winter had made possible. It was more than they had imagined. It was more than either of them had known how to imagine back in September, when they had brought home 47 animals no one believed in. He reached for her hand and held it. The broker arrived the following morning, driving a light wagon with a ledger book under one arm and a practiced eye that had seen 10,000 fleeces from the Missouri to the Rockies. He walked into the barn without ceremony and crouched beside the nearest sack without speaking for a long moment. He pulled a handful of fleece free, held it to the doorlight, worked it between his fingers, and was quiet in the way of a man recalculating something he thought he already understood. He asked where they had gotten the flock. She told him what she knew, which was now considerable. The drover, the bankrupt drive, the Basque shepherd's note, the long mountain breeding. He listened without interrupting. Then he looked at the fleece again and named a price per pound. Her husband asked him to repeat it. He repeated it. They stood there in the barn with the April light coming through the gap above the door, and the flock moving quietly in the pen behind them, and neither of them spoke for a moment, that stretched longer than it should have. Then her husband said yes, and they shook hands on it, and the broker opened his ledger and began to weigh and record with the efficiency of a man who had found what he came looking for. By early afternoon it was settled. The figure written in the ledger was enough to clear the land claim at the county office in town, enough for proper winter fencing, enough for a second room added to the cabin before the next cold season came. Not wealth, not ease, but ground, solid, paid-for ground beneath their feet, and the certain knowledge that it was theirs. The neighbor came by that evening. He stood at the fence post with his hat in his hands and said, quieter than she had ever heard him speak, that he wondered if they might sell him 2 breeding ewes come summer, when the lambs were weaned. He did not mention September. He did not mention the things he had said in the merchant's store. She let it pass without comment, because there was nothing to prove, and the evening was too fine for settling old accounts. After he left, they stood together at the fence in the last of the April light. The flock moved across the near pasture in that unhurried way they had, the way that had taken months to earn. The land looked different from this side of the season. It looked like something that had agreed to belong to them. He reached into his coat pocket and touched the folded claim paper there, and she watched him do it, and understood. $11 and a ruined flock, and a note written in 2 languages they barely read between them. That was where this had started, and what it had grown into. The warmth, the wool, the ground, the life. That was theirs, fully and finally, in a way nothing had ever been before.